we can't thank Morven enough. If you've been to the battlefield, you know that we don't have a visitor center. One day we hope we will, but until we do, we are a mobile feast. And tonight we get to feast on the work of John Rees, author, historian, and expert on the American Revolution. And if you haven't purchased one of John's books, this is a commercial, we have them for sale, and you should have John sign them. He will be signing them after he gets done. This is a very important event, and it's part of a string of important events that we are holding in conjunction with Morven and other outfits. There is a glaring deficit and frightening deficit about knowledge of American history. In 2022, the nation's report card reported that only 1 in 10 eighth graders was proficient in American history. So Morven and PBS are committed to trying to erase that deficit and to try to educate people far and wide about what happened here at this mansion, a half a mile down the road, and throughout the Revolutionary period. These were ordinary men who did extraordinary things, and if it weren't for them, we'd be singing God Save the King today instead of the Star-Spangled Banner. The thing that is even more remarkable about them is that we don't know much about them. Certainly the common soldiers are less well known than the guys who had shoes. We know George Washington, we know General Cadwalader. We know the 10 officers who died at the Battle of Princeton, but we don't know the 20 enlisted men who died, and that's wrong, and we are dedicated to changing that. But if the common soldier is not well remembered, there is a subset of the common soldiers who are even less well remembered, and that would be the black soldiers who fought at the Battle of Princeton and throughout the war. And John has spent his professional career writing about the Revolution, writing about the soldiers in the American Revolution, and his first book, They Were Good Soldiers, African Americans Serving in the Continental Army, broke important ground on covering these forgotten soldiers. He has now collaborated with Don Troiani, who is one of America's foremost war artists, to create a new book that is available today. And John is the perfect guy to tell this story. Most historians are faculty members or longtime professional writers. John spent most of his career in the Postal Service. But John became involved in the living history pastime in 1984 and became so engrossed in history that he started research and writing, typically spurred on by gaps in the commercial historical record, like about ordinary soldiers and black soldiers. By the mid-1990s, with several published articles behind him, he was fully committed to researching and writing about the Revolutionary era, a vocation he followed in between family and work for 36 years. So who better than to write this book than John? Now, a quick word about Don Troiani, his partner. If you love history, you've seen his work. He is by far the historical artist of this century in the tradition of Trumbull, Peale, Chappell, and Howard Pyle. So I'd like you to leave here today with 2 things. Number 1, to have learned something about men you didn't know about. And the second thing is to understand their sacrifices, their courage, and their contribution to our independence 248 years ago. With that, John U. Rees.
Thank you very, very much, and thank you, Mark, for those kind words. This is a real honor and a pleasure to speak here tonight, and I really, really do mean that. I have to remember to put my glasses on. I've forgotten that in the past couple presentations. I want to start with a quote by Ursula K. Le Guin, a science fiction author, but I love this quote. "There is a great river, and it flows through this land, and we have named it history." In a relatively short time, I hope to give some idea of African Americans serving as Continental Army soldiers. Along the way, I'll share the stories of several individuals, take a look at how soldiers of color were treated, and tie it all together with some insights into the numbers. I will also read a portion of the only known still existing letter written by a revolutionary black soldier to his wife. One of the earliest mentions I'd uncovered of Continental Army black soldiers was in a memoir by 5th Massachusetts white Revolutionary veteran Henry Hallowell. He gave this simple but fitting tribute to the men of African descent he served with. In my company, there was 4 Negroes named Jephthah Ward, Job Upton, Douglas Littleton, and Palm Simmons. Part of them called on me after their time was out. They were good soldiers. Looking into those veterans' military records, I found that Jephthah Ward had served 5 years, 1779 to 1783. Job Upton enlisted in May 1777, was discharged after 1 year, while Douglas Middleton served 3 years, beginning in April 1777. Palm Simmons served 6 years, enlisting 19 March 1778 for 3 years and re-enlisting in 1781 for the war. Simmons went to Virginia in 1781 under the Marquis de Lafayette, serving in the hard-marching summer campaign against Lieutenant General Charles Lord Cornwallis's army that precipitated the British surrender at Yorktown. That single reference and those brief service records, plus my reading of Benjamin Quarles's excellent 1961 book, The Negro and the American Revolution, pushed me to learn more about the men of color who fought in our founding war. Now, before I go into the main portion of my talk, whoops, all right, I'll just do it this way. There we go. Before I go to the main portion of my talk, I want to mention the segregated regiments of color that served in the War of the Revolution. Segregated regiments and smaller units were formed by several nations during the war, but they were not the norm. They do, however, serve as a counterpoint to practices in the Continental Army and state militias, 1775 to 1783. Representing 4 armies, here they are. The earliest was the Loyalist Ethiopian Regiment, formed by Crown Governor John Murray, Earl of Dunmore, in 1775, with freed slaves, mostly from Virginia. Also known as Dunmore's Black Regiment, that unit was involved in the November 15 action at Kemp's Landing near Norfolk, and then 24 days later in the Great Bridge Battle, where British and Loyalist forces were defeated. Decimated by smallpox, in June 1776, Lord Dunmore wrote, "Had it not been for this horrid disorder, I should have had 2,000 blacks." Roughly 300 black men, women, and children remained when that unit was disbanded in September 1776. Of those, only 150 were soldiers. 6 months later, in March 1777, British Commander-in-Chief Sir William Howe directed that all Negroes, mulattoes, and other improper persons who have been admitted into Loyalist Corps be immediately discharged. In essence, this meant that armed blacks were barred from serving in Crown-established Loyalist regiments. In March 1779, France formed the Chasseurs Volontaires de Saint-Domingue in what later became known as Haiti. The regiment consisted of free men of color, with blacks and mulattoes separated into their own companies, reflecting the colorism rife in Saint-Domingue society. The Chasseurs Volontaire commander, or white commander, Colonel Rouvray, was proud of his men who joined without enlistment bonuses. The colonel asked for the abolishment of humiliating and degrading distinctions that had been heaped upon them, and wished that his men's creed would be, "I must make the whites blush for the scorn they have heaped on me and my civil status, and for the injustices and tyrannies they have continually exercised over me with impunity. I must prove to them that as a soldier I am capable of at least as much honor and courage, and of even more loyalty." Their only large-scale action was at the siege of British-held Savannah in autumn 1779. Most of the unit was disbanded by early 1780, but one element served until 1784 on the West Indian island of Grenada. Next, Spain. The Havana battalions of free blacks and mulattoes, segregated by color, were first formed in Cuba in 1762, previously having operated only by companies. Men of color joining these units enjoyed a rise in societal status, plus special benefits for themselves and their families. Picked detachments served in ad hoc grenadier and light battalions during the 1781 operations to take Pensacola, Florida, where they fought well. They remained in high esteem well into the 19th century. In 1795, one of their most severe detractors felt compelled to state they were, without a doubt, some of the best soldiers in the world. Contrary to those examples, most of the Continental Army was thoroughly and constantly integrated from the first day of the conflict to its last. while British regiments had only black musicians, servants, and laborers, and most Loyalist units followed suit. That said, there was a single segregated Continental Army regiment manned by private soldiers of black or Indian heritage, commanded by white officers, sergeants, and corporals. That unit was the so-called Black 1st Rhode Island Regiment. In time, it became the corps most often associated with African-American Revolutionary soldiers. Although the unit was an outlier in a largely integrated army, it saw hard service and has an intriguing, though much mythologized, history, and as such, it should be discussed in some detail. Little is known of African-American numbers in the early war Rhode Island military establishment, but in 1775, Massachusetts General William Heath noted, "The regiments of Rhode Island have a number of Negroes and Indians." All the Rhode Island regiments from 1775 through 1777 contained soldiers of color serving alongside their white comrades. With the Continental Army's 1777 rebirth, only the 1st and 2nd Rhode Island regiments remained, recruited with men enlisted or re-enlisted for 3 years or the duration of the war. On October 22, 1777, the 2 Rhode Island regiments, supported by artillery, successfully defended Fort Mercer, New Jersey, against a brigade of Hessian troops. 5 days after the battle, both regiments numbered 369 non-commissioned officers, musicians, and privates. Of those fighting at Fort Mercer, 48, 12.6%, were soldiers of color, including 39 African Americans, 10% of the whole, 7 Native Americans, almost 2%, and 2 mixed African Indians, 0.5%. The Rhode Island regiments were particularly hard hit during the 1777 campaign, and the state had to consider how to recruit them. General James Varnum recommended in January 1778 that a battalion of Negroes be raised in Rhode Island. That February, the state legislature resolved that any Negro, mulatto, or Indian man slave in this state may enlist into either of the 2 battalions to serve during the continuance of the war. It was eventually determined that these recruits would join only the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, and that unit would be filled with freed slaves, free blacks and Indians, as well as veteran black and Indian soldiers, all under the charge of white commanders. Governor Nicholas Cook noted in late February, "The number of slaves in this state is not great, but it is generally thought that 300 and upwards will be enlisted. Any slaves accepted received their freedom, and their owners remunerated." Unpopular with many residents, in early May, the legislature set a June 10, 1778 cutoff date for slave recruiting, though free blacks and Indians could continue to enlist. Despite Governor Cook's assurances, less than 190 African Americans ever joined the 1st Regiment and was never able to form a full battalion for service with General George Washington's main army. While the 1st Rhode Island command staff was recruiting slaves in their home state, the regiment's white enlisted personnel remaining at Valley Forge were incorporated into the 2nd Regiment. At the same time, the veteran black and Indian soldiers from both regiments were formed into a single segregated company under Captain Thomas Arnold. Arnold's 60-strong company belonged to the absent 1st Regiment, but while with the main army, fielded with Colonel Israel Angle's 2nd Rhode Island. When Washington's forces confronted the British at the June 28, 1778 Battle of Monmouth, Captain Arnold's Black Company marched to Monmouth Courthouse with Varnum's brigade and Major General Charles Lee's advance force. About midday, during the battle, having earlier attacked the British rearguard, Lee's men retreated in the face of superior forces. Meeting the advancing main army, General Lee encountered Washington, who placed Lee in charge of an ad hoc holding action behind a hedge fence. Lieutenant Colonel Jeremiah Olney described the Rhode Island troops during the ensuing defense. After retiring something more than a mile, Varnum's brigade, including the Rhode Islanders, were ordered to halt and form by a cross fence to cover 2 pieces of artillery which were in danger of being lost. We there exchanged about 10 rounds and were then obliged to retire with a considerable loss, but not until the enemy had outflanked us and advanced with charged bayonets to the fence by which we had formed. Our brigade suffered more than any that was engaged. The enemy did not pursue us far in our retreat, observing our army formed on the heights in our rear. Captain Arnold's leg was amputated as a result of his wound in that action, and one of Arnold's men, Richard Rhodes, related in the 19th century, "He is very much crippled in one arm in consequence of a wound received in the Battle of Monmouth. He was born in Africa, brought to this country, and sold as a slave, and enlisted in the Black Regiment to obtain his freedom." Arnold's company joined the 1st Rhode Island in July 1778. That regiment went on to see combat at the August 1778 Battle of Rhode Island and remained in their home state until marching to New York in early 1781. Thus, the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment existed as such only from March 1778 to June 1780, 2 years and 3 months. During that same period, the 2nd Rhode Island was a segregated white regiment. The Black 1st Rhode Island was never large enough to form a full regiment, and because of that, never served with Washington's main army until 1781, when his remaining 2 companies were consolidated with the 2nd Rhode Island to form a single Rhode Island regiment. Now, let's look briefly. Oops, let's see. There we are. Let's look briefly at Rhode Island soldier of color numbers from 1777 to 1781. At the October 22, 1777 defense of Fort Mercer, the integrated 1st and 2nd regiments together contained 48 soldiers of color. Black soldiers themselves comprised 10.6% of the 2 units' total strength. In August 1778, the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment contained 188 black soldiers, plus 5 Indians and 4 mixed Indian-African. By September 1779, the 1st Rhode Island had only 147 soldiers of color, and by June 1780, only 124 black and Indian soldiers remained. Those men were formed into 2 large companies and attached to an understrength state 6-month levy battalion. Early in 1781, those 2 companies were joined with the men of the 2nd Regiment to form the Rhode Island Regiment. That September, just prior to the Yorktown siege, that corps had 7 white companies and 2 mixed black and Indian companies. Combined, those last companies numbered 108 privates. Adding black musicians and men on other duty, at that time, soldiers of color comprised 31% of the Rhode Island Regiment. To repeat, the segregated 1st Rhode Island Regiment was an outlier, an experiment born of necessity in an army of integrated units. That experiment was largely unsuccessful, but through no fault of its own. The fact that the regiment remained seriously understrength for the entire term of its existence was largely due to the legislature cutting off slave enlistment only 4 months after it was begun. Still, in the 19th century, the Black Regiment became a symbol and example of African American ability as soldiers, and was seen by many as the precursor of the United States colored regiments and later segregated American units that served from the 1860s Civil War until into the mid-20th century. Now let's look at the rest of the Continental Army. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. When those words were made public in 1776, Africans had been enslaved in British North America for almost 160 years, and African Americans had been fighting 14 months for the cause of American independence in the Continental Army, Navy, and States Militia. Not for another 89 years would slavery in the United States be legally ended. Black soldiers' motivation for joining the Continental Army and their treatment while serving are important to any discussion of their military experience. The reasons somewhat mirrored those of their fellow white and Indian soldiers. Some fought for national independence and hoped for opportunities in a new republic. Some joined for the adventure of military service, sometimes connected to the prospect of serving alongside family or friends. Others were at least partly enticed by the lure of an enlistment bounty or regular pay. Some joined as paid substitutes in place of those who could afford the fee. And after the ideals espoused in the Declaration of Independence, some men fought for their own freedom or for that of their loved ones. Forced service was another factor. If they were on the militia rolls, both white and black men periodically faced the chance of being drafted for a short-term stint in a Continental Regiment. Whites were occasionally compelled to enlist, but enslaved African Americans were more often coerced or forced by their masters to serve. Many, especially in New England, were promised freedom in return for military service. Most of those promises were honored, but some veterans were kept in bondage after they're discharged. Of course, the major dividing line between white and black common soldiers was the American system that enslaved 95% of the country's people of African descent and relegated blacks to underclass status. In light of their treatment in civilian society, one remarkable result of researching black Continental soldiers is finding that they largely received the same considerations as their white comrades, unlike the American Civil War. At the most basic level, soldiers of color, both African and Native Americans, received the same pay, provisions, clothing, and equipment as white soldiers. Both whites and soldiers of color suffered together in times of scarcity and jointly enjoyed the rare times of bounty. The most glaring case of unequal treatment was that black soldiers were, with very few exceptions, barred from serving in any other rank than drummer, fifer, or private soldier. There were other inequities. Early in the war, Africans were occasionally singled out for labor details, but that ended by 1778. There are also indications that black enlisted men served as officer servants more often than white soldiers, but that remains unsubstantiated. Finally, while there were likely difficulties due to officers or fellow soldiers' personal or race animus, to date no such instances have come to light. Now let's turn to an overview of early service. Black Americans were in the fight from the first. Massachusetts militiamen of color, free and enslaved, fought alongside their white comrades from Lexington to Concord and back to Boston on April 19, 1775. To date, we have the names of 35 black men present that day, at least 18 seeing combat. One, Prince Estabrook, was wounded with Captain John Parker's company on Lexington Green. It's likely that as many as 40 to 50 African Americans were with the militia that war's first day. And I must note that black musket-bearing soldiers, continentals, and militia went on to fight in every major battle of the war and in most, if not all, of the lesser actions. 2 months later, at least 88 black and 15 Indian soldiers are known to have been present, or known to have served at the 17 June Bunker Hill battle. One historian estimates the total may have been as high as 150, roughly 5% of American troops involved. There are several mentions of black participation in those early actions, but this is my favorite, speaking to the courage and resilience of African-American soldiers and the effect one man's determination had on another. John Greenwood, a white soldier, noted, "Everywhere the greatest terror and confusion seemed to prevail. As I ran along the road leading to Bunker Hill, it was filled with chairs and wagons bearing the wounded and the dead. Never having beheld such a sight before, I felt very much frightened. I could positively feel my hair stand on end. Just as I came near the place, a Negro man, wounded in the back of his neck, passed me, and his collar being open, and he not having anything on except his shirt and trousers, I saw the wound quite plainly, and the blood running down his back. I asked if it hurt him much. He said no, that he was only going to get a plaster put on it, and meant to return. You could not conceive what encouragement this immediately gave me. I began to feel brave and like a soldier from that moment, and fear never troubled me afterward during the whole war." Despite their proven ability, early on, some considered African Americans unfit for military service. At first, enslaved men were barred from enlisting. In July 1775, Adjutant General Horatio Gates issued recruiting offers to regimental officers. You are not to enlist any deserter from the ministerial army, nor any stroller, Negro, meaning enslaved man, or vagabond, or person suspected of being an enemy to the liberty of America, nor any under 18 years of age. 2 months later, New Jersey Congressman Richard Smith noted, Tuesday, 26 September, the committee brought in a letter to General Washington. In the course of it, South Carolinian Edward Rutledge moved that the general shall discharge all the Negroes, as well slaves as freemen, in his army. He, Rutledge, was strongly supported by many of the Southern delegates, but so powerfully opposed that he lost the point. In the next few passages, the term Negro is also used to denote all blacks. By contrast, in October 1775, Council of Officers agreed unanimously to reject all slaves and by a great majority to reject Negroes altogether. On November 12, Army orders directed, neither Negroes, boys unable to bear arms, nor old men unfit to endure the fatigues of the campaign are to be enlisted. Signaling a change of policy, at the end of December, General George Washington told of numbers of free Negroes who were desirous of enlisting, and with Congress's permission, he gave leave to the recruiting officers to entertain them. And as a side note, African Americans were never evicted from the Army and continued to serve during this entire 8-month paper exercise of deciding if they should be soldiers or not. Given the desperate need to fill continental regiments, General Washington's February 21, 1776 recruiting instructions stated that officers were expressly forbid enlisting any boys, old men, or slaves, with no mention of barring free blacks. Eventually, individual states began allowing enslaved soldiers as well, and by 1778, they formed a sizable minority in Washington's army. A number of observers noted the fact of African Americans in the ranks, some unfavorably, with the claim they were unsuited to be soldiers, but positive remarks were in the majority. In response to John Adams' October 1775 question about black soldiers in the Massachusetts regiments, Adams called them unsuitable for service. General William Heath replied, there are in the Massachusetts regiments some few lads and old men in several regiments, some Negroes. Such is also the case with regiments from the other colonies. Rhode Island has a number of Negroes and Indians. Connecticut has fewer Negroes but a number of Indians. The New Hampshire regiments have less of both. The men from Connecticut, I think, are in general rather stouter than those of either of the other colonies, but the troops of our colony are robust, agile, and as fine fellows in general as I would ever wish to see in the field. General John Thomas was more emphatic. In the regiments at Roxbury, the privates are equal to any that I served with last war. Very few old men, and in the ranks, very few boys. We have some Negroes. Now, both generals are actually prevaricating because actually they had a lot of black soldiers, even in 1775. But they're trying to tone down the numbers of blacks in the Army. We have some Negroes, but I look on them in general equally serviceable with other men for fatigue and inaction. Many of them have proved themselves brave. Europeans were also complimentary. In December 1777, a German officer wrote of the American Revolutionary Forces, "The Negro can take the field in his master's place. Hence, you never see a regiment in which there are not a lot of Negroes, and there are well-built, strong, husky fellows among them." And I have to note here that this statement refers to masters enlisting their enslaved men into military service in place of themselves serving. And Baron Ludwig von Closen, aide-de-camp to French General Rochambeau, wrote in July 1781, "I had a chance to see the American army man for man. It is really painful to see those brave men almost naked with only some trousers and little linen jackets. Most of them without stockings, but, would you believe it, very cheerful and healthy in appearance. It is incredible that soldiers composed of men of every age, even children of 15, of whites and blacks, unpaid and rather poorly fed, can march so fast and withstand fire so steadfastly." As for numbers, Closen claimed, "A quarter of Washington's army were Negroes, merry, confident, and sturdy." Regarding Closen's estimate of numbers, my research indicates that while the proportion of black soldiers, black Continentals actually, likely increased in the later war years, they were closer to 15% of the army by 1781. Now, we'll look a bit more into numbers. At the onset of the War for American Independence, approximately 480,000 African Americans lived in the colonies, of whom roughly 24,000 were free, meaning some 456,000, 95%, were enslaved. Total American population at the time was approximately 2.5 million. Using these numbers, free blacks comprised less than 1% of the overall population, and slaves formed 18%. By comparison, roughly 5,000 to 7,000 African American soldiers and sailors, free and slave, served the revolutionary cause. In August 1778, a document entitled "A Return of the Negroes in the Army" tallied the number of black men in 15 brigades of General George Washington's main army. Long thought to enumerate all the men of African descent in those brigades, we now know it reveals the number of enslaved soldiers in those forces. A careful and in-depth study by historian Matthew C. White has shown that in mid to late 18th century official or legal papers, and often in other texts, the term Negro alluded to enslaved people. Thus, that roster shows there were 755 slave soldiers in Washington's army that month. In a force totaling almost 21,000 rank and file, corporals, music, and private soldiers, they comprised 3.6% of the whole. By themselves, enslaved soldiers conformed two understrength regiments, each equal to or larger in size than most other serving Continental regiments. We have no idea how many free blacks were then serving, but they were possibly at least on par, or possibly less, than at least on par with their enslaved comrades. If that is true, then 7.2% of the force in question were free and enslaved black men. Here then are the 6 brigades reporting the highest proportions of enslaved soldiers in the August 1778 return. As you can see, 3 are from New England, 3 are from southern states. North Carolina ranks 4th. And as you can see, these brigades' percentages are all higher than the 15 brigade proportion of 3.63%. And using those numbers, we can calculate the average number of enslaved soldiers per regiment within each brigade. And with this criteria, North Carolina moves up to 2nd. So we can see Parsons, Connecticut at the top with 37 enslaved soldiers per brigade. Again, not including free blacks. And North Carolina with 29 enslaved soldiers per regiment. Here we have a modern image of a single company of Henley's additional regiment in 1779. It's a good representation of how many Continental companies would have appeared, with some having a few more black soldiers and others perhaps none at all. As seen in our discussion of the 1778 Army return, the proportion of African American soldiers was relatively small, but that's not as important as their mere presence in mixed regiments. One reason is the equation of military service with citizenship, a concept that continued into the mid-19th century. More importantly, foreign observers and others likely consider African Americans serving alongside white soldiers as a radical revolutionary statement almost on par with taking up arms against the King's Army and independence from Britain. It may have been an unintentional and to some an unwelcome political statement, but it was just as powerful as the purposeful and just as pragmatic arming of blacks during the 1860s American Civil War. From numbers, let's turn to two individual soldier stories. These come from veterans' 19th century pensive narratives, which historian John C. Dan called one of the largest oral history projects ever undertaken. Jacob Francis was born in New Jersey and eventually served in the Massachusetts Continental Regiment for 1 year and then in the New Jersey Militia from 1777 to the war's end. Francis was born in January 1754 and testified, "When I was of age, I was bound as an indentured servant by my mother, a colored woman, to one Henry Wambow in Anwell Township." His indenture was sold to 3 other masters and eventually, at a little over 13 years of age, to Joseph Saxton, who took him from New York to an island in the Caribbean and then to Salem, Massachusetts, where his contract was sold one more time. In January 1775, his contract ended, having served his last master for, according to Francis, 6 years until I was 21 years of age. Still living in Salem, Jacob Francis enlisted in autumn 1775 for 1 year in Colonel Paul Sargent's 16th Continental Regiment belonging to Massachusetts. During that term, he served at the Boston Siege and witnessed the battles of Long Island and White Plains. A short time after the fall of Fort Lee on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River, Francis and his comrades marched across New Jersey, crossed the river into Pennsylvania, and then marched down to camp, as he wrote, off from the Delaware River, a few miles below Coryell's Ferry, present-day Lambertville, and above Cowell's Ferry, where we lay there a week or two. In his pension application, Jacob quite accurately described the January 26, 1776 attack on the Hessians at Trenton. He wrote, "We received orders to march, and Christmas night crossed at the Delaware River, down to Trenton early in the morning. We entered the west end of the town, and General Washington came in to the north end. We marched down the street from the river road into the town. General Washington was at the head of that street coming down towards us, and some of the Hessians were between us. There, we had the fight. About half an hour after the firing ceased, General Lord Sterling, an American general, rode up to Colonel Sargent, and we followed him down through the town toward the Assunpink Creek and crossed to the north side of it, where we were formed in line in view of the Hessians, who were paraded on the south side. Being hemmed in, the Hessians surrendered, grounded their arms, and marched down to the old ferry below the Assunpink Creek, where they were ferried to the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware." Jacob Francis soon ended his Continental Army career, being discharged at Trenton soon after the battle. The remainder of Francis's lengthy deposition recounts his militia service. Too long to recount here, he did state, "I always went out when it came my turn to the end of the war." Of all the Black Virginia Continentals I found, Andrew Pebbles has perhaps the most varied career. In his pension testimony, Pebbles noted he didn't recall the year he enlisted, being a poor, unlearned mulatto. According to his military records, it was September 15, 1777. He testified that he joined the camp at Valley Forge and was placed under the command of Captain Lewis Booker, 11th Virginia Regiment, for 2 years. At Trenton, he served 1 year in the artillery under Captain William Miller, 1st Continental Artillery Regiment, who commanded the gun with 12 men to which he belonged. He served for 2 years under Captain Michael Rudolph of Maryland in the light infantry commanded by Colonel Harry Lee, father of Robert E. Lee, whose command was composed of infantry and cavalry and called Lee's Legion. He was in 3 general actions, at Monmouth, Guilford Courthouse, and at Eutaw Springs. At Eutaw Springs, he received 3 wounds. He was wounded in the shoulder slightly, lost the thumb of the left hand, and was bayoneted in the belly. He was just discharged on the Combahee River, South Carolina, honorably. The day before he was discharged, he was in a battle in which Colonel John Lawrence, who commanded in the absence of Colonel Lee, was killed, and that was on August 27, 1782. Pebbles, though a free man, had to deal with the issue of slavery post-war. In his pension, he testified, "By occupation, I'm a miller. From the infirmities of old age, increased by the wounds received in the Revolutionary War, I'm not able to render much service to my employer. I am a free mulatto. My wife and child who live at the mill where I do are slaves. My wife's name is Rachel, aged between 50 and 60 years, and my child's name is Ursula, aged 11 years. Several other Southern veterans told of enslaved family members when they applied for pensions in the early 19th century. Augmenting those on screen, in 1789, New Jersey veteran Jacob Francis struck another small blow for freedom. Former slave Phyllis Duncan testified she was present and saw Mary Francis married to Jacob Francis by Cato Finley. At the time of said marriage, Phyllis and Mary Francis and Cato Finley all lived with and were the slaves of Nathaniel Hunt, where the marriage took place. Jacob Francis, immediately after his marriage, bought Mary from her master. Mary, in a few days, left the employ of Hunt and went with her family, and since that time lived together as man and wife up until the death of Jacob, and raised a family of children. I now want to speak of the African American women who, by their own free will or the will of others, served with the Army. To correct the popular idea of Army women, black and white, they were by and large respectable and respected. Any women who were not long tolerated. I've discovered a number of black women with the Army, some of them servants. One of those was Hannah Till, who served in General Washington's military household for most of the war and gave birth to a son at Valley Forge. Another was Sarah, and she's pictured with her son. A slave who emancipated herself and her son and joined the 1st Maryland Regiment for several months in 1778. But I want to focus on one woman, Judith Lines, and read a portion of a letter written to her by her husband, published for the first time in my first book. Before I go on, I must say that there are 2 other known letters from Continental Army black soldiers, one of them enslaved and the other a freedman. Both men could not write and dictated their missives to someone else. Those letters were not sent to family. One letter was written to the slave soldier's master, while the other was to the soldier's former owners. To preface the Lines letter, John Lines enlisted in the 5th Connecticut Regiment in March 1781 for 3 years. Part of his time was spent at West Point and other Hudson Highland posts. By Judith Lines' own testimony, they married in July 1781. She recalled, "The next summer after I married, he sent for me to come to him. I think the place was called the Highlands. At that time, my husband was a waiter for Colonel Sherman, and while at the camp, I had the smallpox. I think I stayed about 3 or 4 months. Mrs. Lines noted in a pension application, my husband used to write to me when he was in the Army, and I have one of his letters now, which I give to the magistrate, who takes this, my deposition. It is dated November 11th, 1781. It is in the handwriting of my husband." Now the letter. I take this opportunity to send to you, my dear and loving wife, to let you know I am well and hoping these lines may find you and the children well. This is the 6th letter of mine, and I haven't received one. I belong to Colonel Isaac Sherman's regiment, Captain Rice's company. We lay at Fishkill now. I should be very glad if you would send me a letter how you have lived this summer, and whether the house is done, and whether you killed that cow, or whether you have got another. I want to know all these things very much. I intend to come home this winter if I can, but I don't know if I can. If I could see you myself, then I could talk with you, my dear wife, as I like. I have seen hard times. I have lived 11 days with bread only. I remain your loving husband until death, John Lines. Now, Mr. Lines' letter not only tells of his own circumstances, but of Judith's too. On her own, she was raising 3 children, the youngest about 4 years old. She was also running a small land holding, possibly by herself or with the help of relatives or a hired hand, we just don't know. We also don't know if she took her children to camp in 1782 or left them behind, but by her own testimony, Judith had smallpox while with the Army, a deadly and disfiguring disease that most soldiers have been inoculated against. And here we see on the left the effects of unvaccinated smallpox, which, if the patient survived, would likely leave scars all over the face and body. Now, this chart's derived from my research on my newest book, and it shows a timeline over basically 111 years and 4 wars. Black men, Americans and others, were indeed good soldiers and citizens, even when faced with the growth of racism beginning in the late 18th century. Racial animosity was reflected in the military, too, beginning with integration and inclusion in most French and Indian War American provincial units, and in continental forces and state militias during the War of the Revolution. The exclusion of black men in the Army first took hold in the 1790s, though not by government statute. By 1802, integration was back, with support or lack thereof already split between North and South. The ban on black soldiers in federal and state regiments is tied to the ascent of Southern commanders before, but especially after, the War of 1812. Towards the end of that conflict, with James Monroe as Secretary of War and men such as South Carolinian George Izard in high command and Virginian Winfield Scott, a rising star, there seems to have been a sub-rosa movement to cull black men from the Army. Oddly enough, one piece of evidence was included in an War of 1812 soldiers' enlistment record, where Colonel and North Carolinian Henry Atkinson noted, discharged under an order from the War Department directing all soldiers of color should be discharged. That can be paired with Major General Izard's July 1814 letter to Secretary of War John Armstrong concerning newly arrived recruits, or black recruits. Izard posed a quasi-question, noting that there was some years ago a regulation of our service prohibiting the enlistment of Negroes and people of color. I've not heard of it being enforced. In 1817, President Monroe appointed South Carolinian John C. Calhoun as Secretary of War, a position he occupied until 1825. Calhoun had a profound impact on the United States Army, including a comprehensive reorganization and the creation of the West Point Military Academy. Concurrent with Missouri Compromise, Calhoun implemented a ban on black soldiers, not via federal law, but in a mundane February 18, 1820 Army order regarding recruiting. Issued by the Adjutant and Inspector General's office, it directed no Negro or mulatto will be received as a recruit of the Army. Following that, Winfield Scott's 1821 general regulations for the Army restricted enlistment to all free white male persons. That explains why black men were barred from serving in federal regiments in the 1840s war with Mexico, and in part, why segregated regiments became the norm from the American Civil War to the mid-20th century. For many black veterans, service in the War of the Revolution was a mark of pride. The first Revolutionary War pension legislation was enacted in 1818. The ensuing acts required that veterans show they were in need in order to be awarded a pension. In July 1820, Artillo Freeman submitted a tally of his belongings. With no real estate or fixed income, Freeman noted, he has no trade, but picks oakum for a living when he was able to work. Mr. Freeman's possessions included bed and beddings, 4 chairs, crockery, pots, kettles, pans, 1 coat, 3 shirts, 1 chest and trunk, his wife and child's clothes, a small quantity of personal apparel, and 1 pig, all worth $15.75. At the end of the list, he added 1 more item, Revolutionary uniform, invaluable. Several more things before I yield the floor. Soon after turning in the new book's manuscript, I was told by the editor that the main narrative needed to be halved. And I was able to do it rather quickly and rather easily without harming the thesis. What's in these monographs is basically in the book, it's just in a more abridged version. But these several in-depth studies were cut from the book, and then plus a new one on black soldiers serving in the Hessian regiments. So these standalone monographs you can access for free online, and I have my card here if you're interested in getting the links for them. And here are several links to my collected works online. I have I think it's over 200 articles written, most of them online, and all available for free and downloadable as a PDF. Plus, there are several articles on men and women of the color of the armies of the Revolution. And there's my first book and its contents. And there's the current book. Thank you very much. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes to ask John questions. I'm sure we all learned a lot today, and you may have more questions. So does anybody from the floor have a question? Don't be shy. There you go.
When a black soldier is listed as a musician, were they drummers communicating on the battlefield, or was there some other sort of music being employed by the military?
They would have normally been either a drummer or a fifer. The drums were The drums could be heard better. They were usually used for communication. Oops, I'm sorry. The drums could be heard more on the battlefield, so they were usually used as communication. But often during a battle, a lot of the drummers, some or all the drummers would be relegated to taking the wounded off the battlefield. But there also were regimental bands, and I don't know of any black soldiers serving in regimental bands. There weren't. I would say there's probably 4 or 5 of them in the Continental Army, but I don't know of any black musicians serving in regimental bands thus far.
I think I saw a hand over there, yeah.
Thank you very much. In all the correspondence that you've read, do you pick up on any comments about the treatment by their fellow soldiers? Does that come across in, I know there's only a few letters there, but is there any sense of that? And is there a difference, for instance, between Rhode Island and Virginia?
I mean, north or south, you see them being badly post-war when they're trying to apply for pensions. But during the war, and I've read a lot of correspondence, and nothing has come forth except for how they were treated by some civil authorities. And I used to include it into my presentation, but there's an incident when marching south, and that's the Rhode Island Regiment marching south. They went to Yorktown, and then coming back, they stopped in Maryland and were housed in Maryland for a while. And one of the black members of the Rhode Island Regiment, at head of Elk, well, actually, there was a party of them staying in this house, white and black Rhode Island soldiers staying in this one house. And this party of local sailors came in, harassed them the night before. They were finally thrown out of the house. And then they came back the next day and asked the owner for liquor and were abusing the soldiers. Actually knocked down a white soldier, and Fortune Stoddard, the black Rhode Islander, took his musket and fired at the captain of the party and mortally wounded him. And he was tried for manslaughter, convicted, branded on what they said, they branded on the brawn of the thumb with a hot iron, and then had to pay a fine. Now, the thing is, this had happened about 12 months before, but in Rhode Island. Pretty much the exact same thing, except for it wasn't a civilian. It was a civilian, but it was a man on guard, a black Rhode Island soldier on guard, who had killed a white resident who was basically trying to harass him. Exact same thing. He was tried for manslaughter, convicted, branded on the thumb, which was a common, white or black, that was a common punishment, and then had to pay a fine. And either he or his officers paid the fine. Well, nobody paid the fine for Fortune Stoddard. So he was in jail in Elkton, Maryland, and it came about that the local civil authorities said, well, if we don't get the fine, we're going to sell him into slavery to pay the fine. And as I used to say in my presentation, that's something that would never have happened to a white soldier. So yes, there were incidents where they were treated differently, but like I said, I haven't found it in the Army. It's been easily seen that Washington changed his views about slavery during the war, and so did a lot of other officers. Before the war, the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society was founded by Quakers. Stephen Benezet is probably the most notable. Benjamin Lay also contributed. By the end of the war, after the war, when the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society was rechartered in, I think, 1785 or 87, the membership filled up with a lot of Pennsylvania and other veteran officers who had served during the war, because they had served with black soldiers during the war, and it really changed their minds. Washington, freed his slaves in his will, and yes, there were problems because they weren't freed right away, because they were freed upon Martha's death. But still, he did free his slaves, and I think he had a different attitude towards black human beings. Was he a slave owner? Yes, he was a slave owner. So yeah, it's still problematical, but and of course he also had Lafayette nagging at him all the time because Lafayette was an ardent abolitionist early on and then continuing on through. But
I believe there's a gentleman in a green shirt.
I was wondering, are there any notable instances of African Americans or Indians fighting for the other side?
oh yeah, yeah. Like I said, in loyalist regiments supported by the crown, black soldiers could only serve mostly in unarmed roles. But there was one instance where a black musician at the Battle of Spencer's Ordinary saved a British officer, and then he must have had a sword. Could have had a pistol, but he had some kind of weapon, and it actually waded into the fight. I think his name was Pomp London, but I can't remember. But there were also other ones. We don't know the entire truth about this man, but there was a man named. He later became called Colonel Ty. He was enslaved in Monmouth County. At some point, he gained his freedom. Some say he might have joined Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment in Virginia. We just don't know. We don't know. But eventually, he became the head of a band of basically irregular fighters, loyalist fighters, and white and black. And he fought for about 2 years until he was mortally wounded in action. What's that? Monmouth County. Monmouth County, yeah, in New Jersey.
Gentleman
Yeah.
back there.
And correct me if I'm wrong, I thought I overheard you say that the Hessians, the mercenaries from Germany had blacks among their ranks.
Yes.
I'm curious, does the book explore that? And if so, are these blacks that served with those mercenaries, were they like formerly enslaved, or they were promised something, or were they people from other territories?
They seem to have they might have gotten some early on when they were still in the North, but they seem to have gotten most of their black recruits when they went south. And they were all soldiers, even though some of them were just pack horsemen or wagon or cart drivers. But it was after the book, I issued that small study I did, and some people who really know a lot about the Hessians, there are some men in there, black men in there, that are listed as privates, so private soldiers. So they would have been armed. If they were there's a German term for it, but if they were a pack horseman, there was a certain German term for them. If they were doing other labor duties, there were other terms for it. But a private would have been armed. And he said there were more privates. My study showed more black privates in the Hessian regiments than he knew of before. Now, that doesn't mean there were a lot of them, but they were there. And some of them stayed behind. Some of them went to Canada. But I think about 150 men, women, and children went to Germany after the war with the Hessian regiments and became, whatever small duchy or protectorate that they were in, because Germany wasn't a country at that point. That they basically became citizens of that duchy.
Time for one more. Sean.
Was there any role that Washington played with pension requests after the war, having been perhaps inspired, if that's not too strong a word, by what he witnessed? Did he help get their pension?
Not really. The only role I can say he did play was that when the men were discharged, especially at the end of the war, when the men were discharged, who were still serving, they were given discharges more often than not signed by Washington. Sometimes they were signed by another general, but mostly signed by Washington. And those are the discharges that the men, if they still had them, because there are veterans who talk about their children destroying them, or them getting wet and falling apart, or just falling apart between handling and age. That's probably the closest thing you can say about his involvement with getting with the black soldiers, especially post-war. One of the interesting things is that when Lafayette came over in 1824, he went all over the country. At one point, he went to New Orleans, and there was a free black company of soldiers, militia. So this was after the Battle of New Orleans, when the two black battalions served at the Battle of New Orleans. But at that point, they were the Black Corps was still still viable, still going on. And he talked he met them individually, in a body, and he talked about the black soldiers he served with during the war, and then shook everybody's hand at the end of their meeting. So, some officers did have a real feeling for the black soldiers. Washington, as head of the Army, probably treated black soldiers just like he did white soldiers. I mean, they were serving under him, but he had so many other larger concerns that he really didn't pay much attention to individual soldiers.
John, we have an honor for you that Ben will present.
John, on behalf of the Princeton Battlefield Society and our friends here at Morven, this is a pen from the Clark House, a beam from inside the house itself.
That's awesome.
Original house.
That's amazing.
Thank you very much
Thank
for
you
this
very much.
great
Thank you.
presentation today and joining us. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, that concludes our evening, but if you want John to sign a copy of your book, and if you want to buy his book, he'll be sitting out there to do that. Thank you, everybody.
And my cards are at the back of the room. If you want to get any of those articles, like I said, they're free, they're online. And also, there's images from the book in the back of the room, and there's a couple copies back there that you can look through.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.